Podcast Talk.
Learn English naturally.
How English sounds in real life. Most people think English sounds confident, fast, and perfectly formed in real life. But that's not what actually happens. Real English is full of pauses. People restart sentences. They say something simple, then change their mind halfway through. And somehow, the conversation still works. What confuses learners is that this version of English doesn't match what they studied. So they start doubting themselves. They think, I know the words, but I don't sound like this. And that gap creates tension because understanding English feels controlled, but speaking, it feels unpredictable. Today, we're going to talk about what English really sounds like when people aren't performing, aren't teaching, and aren't trying to sound impressive, just living their lives and talking.
Yeah, and I think this is where people get the most frustrated. They listen to native speakers and think, why does this sound so casual, almost unfinished? Because real English isn't built to be correct, it's built to be efficient. I notice this all the time at work. People don't explain things perfectly. They throw out half ideas, pause, adjust, and somehow everyone still understands. But if you learned English from textbooks, you were trained to wait until the sentence is ready. And in real conversations, that moment never really comes. So learners feel late. They feel like the conversation moves faster than they do. But it's not speed, it's flexibility.
Exactly, Jake. And that feeling of being late is such a big clue because native speakers aren't thinking, I need to say this perfectly. They're thinking, I need to react. I remember being in a cafe once, listening to two people talk, and half their sentences were just reactions. Yeah, right? Exactly. Wait, really? And none of that sounded impressive, but it sounded alive. Learners often skip those small reactions because they think they're not real English. But those are the moments that actually hold conversations together.
You're so right about reactions, Emma, because that's the part learners don't practice enough. They practice answers, but real conversation is built on small signals. And those signals are what keep the other person talking. For example, when someone tells you a story, they don't need a perfect response. They need to feel you're with them. So native speakers do this constantly. No way, that's wild. Wait, what happens next? Even a simple right can hold the rhythm of the conversation. And here's the best part. Those reactions also buy you time. You're not freezing in silence while building a perfect sentence. You're inside the conversation, staying present, staying human. Then, once you're already speaking, your longer sentence comes out easier because you're not trying to jump from 0 to perfect. You're stepping in gradually, the way real people actually talk.
And this is where people misunderstand what natural really means. They think natural English is faster or more complex. But most of the time, it's actually softer and simpler. I've noticed that in real conversations, people don't rush to sound smart. They slow down. They leave space. They let sentences breathe. And learners often feel uncomfortable with that silence, so they fill it with overthinking instead of speaking. But silence in real English isn't a problem. It's part of the rhythm. It gives everyone a moment to adjust, to feel the mood, to decide where the conversation is going next. Once you stop fighting that space, English starts to feel less like pressure and more like a shared moment.
Yes, and I want to talk about something very practical here. Think about how conversations actually start. Most of the time, they don't start with a full idea. They start with something incomplete. Someone says, so, or I was thinking, well, then the sentence grows while they're speaking. Learners wait until the thought is finished in their head. But native speakers build the thought out loud. So that's a huge difference. Real English allows you to discover what you're saying while you're already saying it. And when learners give themselves permission to do that, they stop feeling behind. They start moving with the conversation instead of chasing it.
That's such a powerful shift because once you realize you're allowed to think out loud, speaking stops feeling like a performance. I've talked to so many learners who say, I don't know what I think until I say it. And that's not a weakness. That's how conversation works. Real English isn't planned from start to finish. It's shaped moment by moment. So when you speak before everything feels ready, you're not making a mistake. You're joining the flow. And the more often you join, the more familiar that flow becomes. That's when English starts to sound real. Not perfect, but alive.
And Emma, here's a real life example that makes this obvious. Imagine you're at work and someone says, so what's the plan for today? A learner often tries to build the perfect answer like a mini speech. But real English in that moment is usually casual and unfinished. People say things like, I think we'll start with this. Or, okay, so let's see. And then they adjust as they speak. They add details after. They correct themselves mid-sentence. And nobody cares because the goal is coordination, not perfection. So if you want your English to sound real, practice giving real-time responses instead of prepared ones. Start with a simple reaction, then add one more sentence. That's how native speakers keep things moving, not by being perfect, but by being responsive.
Yes, and another place this shows up is with friends. Think about a group chat or meeting someone after a long day. In real life, people don't speak in neat paragraphs. They say a short thing, wait, react, laugh, change topic, come back. Like, you won't believe what happened. And then they pause because the other person's reaction becomes part of the story. Learners sometimes feel like they need to speak continuously, as if silence means failure. But real English has a lot of shared space. It's normal to stop, to search for a word, to say, how do I put this? That phrase alone is very natural. And once you stop treating pauses like danger, your voice sounds calmer, your rhythm sounds more native, and your English starts to match real life more closely.
Exactly, and I want to give one simple rule people can actually use. If you want to sound real, stop trying to sound complete. Real English is often built in layers. Layer 1 is a reaction. Oh, really? That's crazy. Wait, what? Layer 2 is a short idea. Yeah, I was thinking about that. Layer 3 is the detail, because yesterday this happened. When you speak in layers, you never get stuck trying to deliver a perfect sentence. You always have a way in. And this works everywhere, at work, with friends, even in small talk with strangers. So if you freeze, don't fight your brain. Use a layer 1 phrase, then keep going. That's what real speakers do. They don't wait for perfect. They move and meaning catches up.
And this is the part people almost never hear explained clearly. Real English doesn't sound confident because people are confident. It sounds confident because people are comfortable being unclear. They allow themselves to start a thought without knowing how it will end. I've seen this so many times in everyday life. Someone begins a sentence, stops, laughs, rephrases, and the conversation doesn't break. It deepens because that uncertainty feels honest. Learners, on the other hand, often feel pressure to sound finished. But finished language is rare in real conversations. What you actually hear is thinking out loud. So when your English feels messy, it's not a sign you're feeling. It's a sign you're finally speaking the same way real people do.
Yeah, and I want to connect this to something very practical. Think about how often native speakers say things like, I don't know, maybe, kind of, or I guess. Those phrases are everywhere. They soften statements. They leave room for adjustment. Learners sometimes avoid them because they sound unsure. But uncertainty is a feature, not a flaw. It keeps conversations flexible. It allows people to disagree without conflict. So when you add these phrases to your English, you're not weakening your message. You're making it more realistic. That's why real English feels less rigid and more adaptable to the moment.
And this flexibility is exactly why real English feels so different from what people expect. There's no single correct rhythm. Some days people speak slowly, some days they interrupt each other, some conversations are quiet, others messy, and all of that is normal. Learners often search for one right way to sound, but real life doesn't work like that. English changes with your mood, your energy, and the situation. Once you accept that, you stop trying to copy a voice and start using your own. That's when English stops feeling borrowed and starts feeling personal.
Exactly. And if you listen closely, you'll notice something else. Real English is full of small repairs. People say, I mean, or what I'm trying to say is, let me rephrase that. Those phrases exist because real speakers don't expect themselves to get it right the first time. They correct as they go. So if you find yourself changing a sentence midway, that's not a mistake. That's fluency in progress. The goal isn't to avoid correction. The goal is to stay in the conversation while you adjust. That's what keeps English sounding natural instead of rehearsed.
I think this is where a lot of people finally relax. When they realize that real English is not about sounding polished, it's about staying present. In everyday conversations, people don't aim for elegance. They aim for connection. They speak, they notice the reaction, and they adjust. And that constant adjusting is what makes English feel alive. Learners often think fluency means speaking without pauses, but real fluency is knowing how to move forward even when you pause. You can stop, you can rethink, you can change direction, and the conversation still continues. That's because real English is forgiving. It allows space for uncertainty. So when you let yourself be imperfect out loud, you're not lowering your level. You're finally using English the way it's actually used in real life.
And Emma, this is something I really want people to hear clearly. Native speakers don't experience conversations as pressure. They experience them as movement. If one sentence doesn't work, they don't stop. They shift. They add a small clarification. They try again. That's why conversations don't collapse when someone hesitates. They only collapse when someone disappears. Silence caused by fear breaks the flow, but pauses caused by thinking do not. So if you're listening and you often stop yourself mid-sentence, that's not failure, that's adjustment. Real English isn't a straight line. It's a series of small corrections made in real time. Once learners accept that, they stop fighting the conversation and start moving with it.
Yes, and this is why listening alone never feels like enough. You can understand everything and still feel blocked because understanding doesn't train movement. Speaking does. When you speak, you learn how your thoughts land in the real world. You learn how much explanation is needed, where to pause, and how to continue when a sentence doesn't come out right. Those lessons only appear in motion. And once you've had enough of those moments, your brain stops panicking. It recognizes the pattern. It knows there is always a way forward. That's when English stops sounding controlled and starts sounding natural. Not because it's perfect, but because it's flexible.
Let me give a very clear, everyday example because this is where people finally recognize themselves. Imagine you're in a meeting or just talking with coworkers and someone asks a simple question. Not a deep one, just something like, "So what do you think?" For a learner, that moment feels dangerous. Your brain suddenly wants to deliver a full, perfect answer. But real English doesn't work like that. Native speakers often start without knowing where they're going. They say things like, "Well, I'm not completely sure, but," or "I haven't thought about it deeply, but," and while they're speaking, the idea forms. That's not confidence, and that's permission. Permission to think out loud. Permission to adjust. Permission to stay visible even when the thought isn't finished. Once you stop demanding perfection from yourself before speaking, your English stops freezing. It starts flowing because you're no longer trying to solve everything in your head first.
And this is exactly why so many learners feel exhausted after conversations. They're doing two jobs at once. They're trying to think and perform at the same time. But real English separates those roles. You speak first and you refine later. I've noticed this even with very advanced speakers. The ones who sound most natural are not the ones with the biggest vocabulary. They're the ones who trust themselves enough to speak before everything feels ready. They allow their sentences to be imperfect. They allow their tone to change mid thought, and that honesty actually makes them easier to understand. When learners hear this, something clicks. They realize the goal isn't to sound impressive, it's to stay present. And presence is what makes English sound real in everyday life.
Yes, and I want to say this directly to anyone listening right now. If your English sounds slower than your thoughts, that doesn't mean you're behind. It means you care. And caring is not the problem. The problem starts when caring turns into control. When you try to control every word, every sound, every pause, you disconnect from the conversation. Real English isn't controlled, it's responsive. It reacts to the person in front of you. So the shift is not learn more, the shift is allow more. Allow yourself to enter conversations early. Allow yourself to correct mid-sentence. Allow yourself to sound human, because the moment you do that, your English stops feeling like something you manage and starts feeling like something you use.
And this is where I want to slow things down for a moment. Because many learners don't realize how much pressure they put on themselves. They think every sentence needs to prove something, that they are good enough, advanced enough, or ready. But real conversations don't ask for proof. They ask for presence when people talk in real life. They're not measuring their level. They're sharing experiences, reacting emotionally, building meaning together. I've noticed that once learners stop treating English like a performance, Their voice changes. They sound calmer, more relaxed, more themselves. And that's when listeners stop focusing on mistakes and start focusing on the message. Real English doesn't sound perfect. It sounds honest. And honesty is what makes conversations feel natural and human.
Yeah, and Emma, I think this connects directly to confidence. People assume confidence means speaking without hesitation, but in real life, confidence often sounds like comfort with hesitation. Native speakers hesitate all the time. They search for words, they pause, they restart. The difference is they don't judge themselves for it. They stay engaged. They stay visible. I've been in conversations where someone clearly wasn't sure what they wanted to say, but they kept going anyway. And the effort creates trust because the other person feels included in the thinking process. So if you're listening and you hesitate when you speak, that doesn't make your English weak, it makes it real. What matters is that you don't disappear. You stay in the conversation, even while adjusting.
And staying in the conversation is really the key idea here. Because once you stay, everything else improves naturally. Your timing gets better, your reactions get quicker, your sentences feel less heavy. That happens not because you studied harder, but because your brain learned the rhythm. Real English has a rhythm that can't be memorized. It has to be experienced. And every time you choose to speak instead of staying silent, you train that rhythm. You train your ear, you train your voice. So if there's one thing to remember from this, it's this. Real English doesn't ask you to be ready. It asks you to be present, and presence is something you already have.
And I want to end this by saying something very simple, but very honest. If you've been listening to this and thinking, when okay, this finally sounds like what I experience, then you're exactly where you need to be. Real English isn't something you unlock one day. It's something you grow into by staying present in conversations, by reacting even when you're unsure, by speaking even when your sentence isn't finished yet. The goal was never to sound perfect. The goal was to sound real. So take one thing from this episode, one reaction, one pause, one unfinished sentence, and use it the next time you speak. That's how English stops living in your head and starts living in your life. And if this kind of real, honest conversation helps you, subscribe to OffScript English. Write in the comments what situations feel hardest for you or what topics you want us to talk about next. We read everything. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.